Chronix, what do you mean vulnerable sucks? It's literally the best stat in the game. Well, this is true. I am more about the reason behind why vulnerable is so good, and I am very fearful that that exact reason might actually make the game very boring in the long run. But to understand why, we need to understand what makes vulnerable that good of a stat. Now, as we all know, vulnerable enemies take 20% more damage baseline, and you apply vulnerable with several skills, and because of that, vulnerable is not part of the other damage buckets such as damaged versus chilled or close or distant, or not in the same bucket as attack speed or your main stat or the overall damage. It has a bucket for itself. And the stuff with buckets is that if you have one that is separate, that is always going to be much better than having more stuff in just one bucket. It's much better to maximize the amount of buckets and then minimize the amount of stuff that you have in the buckets, because inside of these buckets, the stuff is going to be added on top of each other, and that is going to be multiplied with all the other buckets. And as you can see, you have your all damage, you have your main stat, you have your attack speed, disregarding resource generation and spending, but you also have your crit stuff with crit chance and crit damage, and that's basically all the other stuff that we don't have, and a separate bucket for vuln damage, which is going to be always alone in the bucket and therefore is always going to be very strong and only multiplicative to all the other damage buckets, and is not going to be added into something. And because of how math works, multiplying is always going to be much greater when you have such high numbers than adding stuff together. Now that makes it already very clear why vulnerable is so good and so important when it comes to scaling your damage. This is basically why every build tells you to maximize vulnerable damage, because that's basically the easiest way to scale your damage when you have a reliable source of making the enemy vulnerable. And that really is the problem in itself. If you don't have vulnerable in a build, you basically don't have a build, because you are missing one very, very strong bucket completely. It's basically not in your build, and therefore you lack one of the complete modifiers. Imagine your build wouldn't have any main stat, for example. That's basically the same as your build not having any vulnerable damage or any source of applying vulnerable in the first place. So basically, vulnerable, if you don't have a source of vulnerable that is reliable, there is basically no build. So that basically shoves you in a way towards building a build that needs vulnerable, and therefore all the other cool stuff that you might come up with is basically non-existent after a certain level or a certain difficulty in Nightmare Dungeons, because they don't have access to a reliable source of vulnerable. The problem that I have with vulnerable damage is that, to me, it feels a little bit like, because of the statement, just scale your vulnerable as high as you can, it basically feels like set items all over again, if you think about it. Basically, you're just trying to collect items with a lot of vulnerable damage and just following vulnerable damage. Obviously, all the other stats need to be pretty good, but to have an entrance level build to clear Nightmare Dungeons, just get vulnerable on all of your items and on all of the items that have a possible stat roll for vulnerable. Get that on those stuff, apply the vulnerable and deal your damage, and you're fine. Isn't that basically the same as a set item again? And the set item, or the complete set, says 1 out of 6, 2 out of 6, 3 out of 6, 4 out of 6, 5 out of 6, 6 out of 6. That is basically all your vulnerable damage. And then the set bonus is apply vulnerable, deal huge damage with a big modifier. It's basically exactly the same, and I see this as a big problem, because it's basically just one set for all of the classes. It's not like you have, like in D3, you have like 3 sets that you can pick and choose from. No, in Diablo 4, if vulnerable stays like it is, you basically only have one set for all of the classes. And we have been complaining about set items and sets being so OP and way too build defining and giving us or pushing us in a strong direction and not giving us a lot of variety. And vulnerable is even stronger or even more crazy than set items, because now we don't even have 3 sets anymore. We just have 1 set for all of the classes. So basically everyone is running around with the same set, maximized vulnerable damage and equipped it as much as you can. And the effects are apply vulnerable with skill X, and then all the other skills deal 5,000% more damage. Isn't it the same as sets right now? And I really think the damage calculation, how it was, or the bucket theory, how it was before the embargo got lifted, where the damage versus was another new bucket, where the damage while was another new bucket, or the damage with was another new bucket. And if you create more buckets, then the importance of vulnerable goes down tremendously, because you will have more buckets that you can activate and therefore scale a little bit. And this just diminishes the importance of vulnerable and gives the other stuff a little bit more importance and more stuff to go through. For example, at the moment, if your item doesn't have vulnerable on it, it's basically trash. Or if it has like 3 out of 4 stats that are perfect and 1 is not perfect, it's also okay, because you can use that not perfect stat to roll to vulnerable damage, basically generating a perfect item. But if none of these 2 scenarios is the case, then your item is useless. If you would be able to activate more buckets, then you would also have way more chances of getting a good item, and not only go by, has it either 3 very good stats and 1 very bad stats that I can reroll to vulnerable damage, or does it have a huge amount of vulnerable damage and it's still gonna be quite okay? Now, I'm really curious what you guys think in the comments below, so please enlighten me. Am I wrong? Am I completely off with this? And yeah, if you like content similar to this, make sure to subscribe to the YouTube channel, and I'll see you next time.